Hello, welcome to this video on oligopoly and non-collusive practices. So in this video we're going to look at the kink demand curve and then look at describing different forms of non-price competition. So let's remind ourselves of what we mean by an oligopoly. So here we have a market that's dominated by a few large firms. They have a high market concentration ratio. Each firm uses to brand their similar products but slightly differentiated. They often have high brands. There's higher barriers to entry and exit. And importantly, the firms are very interdependent. So the strategic decisions of one firm influences the other, and they know what each other are doing and take account of those decisions. So we said here, interdependence is important. Strategic independence means that one firm's output and price decisions are influenced by the likely behavior of competitors. Because there are only a few sellers, each firm is likely to be aware of the actions of the others. Decisions of one firm influence and are influenced by the decisions of other firms. And this brings us on to the kink demand curve, which goes to show that even if businesses aren't colluding, even if they're non-collusive, we still might not expect them to compete much on price and end up finding other ways in which to compete. The kink demand curve diagram is down here on the right hand side. As you can see, it's called the kink demand curve because we're going to generate a demand curve that has a kink, has a bend in it. And we're going to look at the derivation of this. How do we get to this diagram now? So a business in an oligopoly faces a downward sloping demand curve. We know that. But the price elasticity of demand, the change in demand when they change price, will depend on the likely reaction of rivals to changes in the firm's price and output, because they're interdependent. So, in one scenario, if we were to increase our price, we would assume that rivals would not follow this approach. So the firm doing that is likely to lose a lot of market share, lose a lot of demand. So raising our price will lead to a relatively elastic response in demand and will lead to less revenue. So what we might do is we might consider reducing our price. But here rivals will know this, they see our actions, and rivals will probably match our fall in price so that they don't lose market share. So in this situation, if we cut price, we're unlikely to see a large increase in demand. So a fall in price and not much of an increase in demand will lead to a fall in total revenue. So if we raise price, we're going to lose customers. If we cut price, we're not going to gain a huge amount. So let's see how this impacts into our kink demand curve analysis. So let's just start with the theory that firms in the market are settled on a price P1 and a quantity Q1. At this price, the demand curve is elastic for prices above P1 and inelastic for prices below P1. We know that elasticity changes as we move along the demand curve. Okay, so let's have a look. If we raise our price above P1, what's the likely reaction of other firms? It's likely that other firms will hold their price at P1. So this is going to cause an elastic response in terms of demand. If I raise my price from P1 to P2, I'm going to lose a lot of demand. I'm going to lose a lot of customers, a lot of market share, Q1 down to Q2. So I face quite an elastic response when I raise my price. This will result in lost sales and falling total revenue. However, let's have a think about what might happen if I was to cut the price. If I cut the price below P1 to P3, what is going to be the likely reaction of other firms? Well, they're not going to want to lose market share to my business. If I cut my price and they know it, they can see it, the likely reaction is that other firms are going to follow suit. They're going to follow suit, they're going to reduce their price. Now, if I reduce my price and everyone else has reduced my price, am I going to gain many customers? Not really. I'm not going to gain many customers Q1 to Q3. So cutting my price has actually had quite an inelastic response. Relatively little benefit in terms of extra customers, and so little benefit in terms of extra sales, and my total revenue is going to decrease. So Above P1, I have a P2 style response, like the demand curve is AR1. Below P1, I have a P3 response, Q3 response, like my demand curve is like AR2. So if I was to link them together, actually, this is what my demand curve looks like. It's not a straight line after all. There is a kink. Above P1, it's very elastic. Below P1, it's very inelastic because of the way that my rivals will respond to my change in price. So for oligopolies, for oligopolistic markets, they're likely to have a demand curve that kinks at the kind of current market price. Now, what does that mean in terms of the marginal revenue curve? Well, remember, the marginal revenue curve is half the gradient of the average revenue curve. So for this part of the curve, half the gradient would be this blue line. But for this part of the curve, AR1, half the gradient would be this blue line down here. And so we can see that actually the marginal revenue, there's a big jump at the point where we move from elastic to inelastic and we cut our prices. We basically, when it's elastic, we go to contributing more to revenue when we cut our price, and as soon as we move to the inelastic part of the curve, when we cut prices further, we're actually reducing revenue. So we have an intersection here where the marginal revenue curve effectively goes down and then jumps down to here. So if we were looking at profit maximizing equilibrium, the marginal cost curve here cuts the marginal revenue curve where it's gone vertical and made the jump. So this would still be our profit maximizing level of output here at this level of output, and this would still be our market price. So one of the key predictions here is that the prices are likely to be quite sticky. The prices are likely to stay around that original settled price. And that's even if there is a change in costs. So for example here, marginal cost curve 1, the profit maximizing level of output is here and the price we would charge is here. Now if there was an increase in variable costs and our marginal cost curve shifted up, what we can see is actually doesn't change the analysis. The marginal cost is equal to the marginal revenue still at this level of output and would still give us a price here. So our prediction here is that even if costs are changing, we would expect prices to remain fairly constant in an oligopoly market. And the key is because of how firms would react to any price change. So a quick summary here. Oligopoly firms may have price setting power, downward sloping demand curves and differentiated products, but they may be reluctant to use that power. Why is that? It's because rivals are unlikely to agree with us to raise prices unless they're acting collusively, and we've assumed here we're not colluding with the other firms. And if we cut our prices, rivals are likely to match a price fall. So it tends to suggest that firms will settle on one particular price and there's little point in changing it. Even if costs change, we often see price rigidity, stability in an oligopoly. So this increases the importance, if we're going to compete to each other, to not compete in price, to try and compete in other ways that are not to do with price. And we call these other forms of competition, where we don't compete on price, non-price competition. So instead of colluding, agreeing higher prices between us, what we might do is take part in non-price competition. And this involves mainly advertising and marketing strategies to increase consumer demand and develop brand loyalty. So some examples of non-price competition. Innovation, coming up with better quality products, may attract more customers. The quality of customer service, including after-sales service. Maybe free upgrades to certain products. Loyalty schemes, loyalty cards is a very common form of non-price competition. Trying to create a brand that develops customer loyalty, or maybe some sort of promotion. Now these might be ways in which we can attract customers and compete with other rivals without having to change our prices within the market. So in this video we've looked at the kink demand curve and why businesses in oligopolistic markets tend to have a kink demand curve. And secondly, we've looked at the fact that, well, if firms are not going to compete on price in an oligopoly market, how can they compete otherwise? Well, they can engage in forms of non-price competition. That's it. Thanks very much for listening.